right, so I'd like to welcome our viewers to another episode of Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. This is a series where we discuss the application of the philosophical tradition of phenomenology to the study of unidentified aerial and anomalous phenomena and close encounters. The series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies, and I am the host, Kimberly Engels. I am really thrilled about my guest today. I am here with Whitley Strieber, who is the best-selling author of Communion, as well as many other books. Whitley, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
I am too. Thank you so much. So I'm going to begin just, in some ways, Whitley needs no introduction, but I also have a little bio here for our viewers. So Whitley Strieber is the author of over 40 books. The Wolfen, The Hunger, War Day, Majestic, Superstorm, and Communion have all been bestsellers. Communion remains the best-selling book on UFOs and aliens in publishing history. The Wolfen, Hunger, Communion, and Superstorm have all been made into films. Superstorm is known as The Day After Tomorrow. His book series, Alien Hunter, was made into the sci-fi series Hunters. His latest books are Them, which is an analysis of communication with the Greys. I actually have them right here. And A Hidden Garden, which is a book of poems. And his new book, which is called The Fourth Mind, is due to be published in early December, so likely not long after this interview airs. Whitley's website, Unknown Country, is the largest website in the world dealing with subjects on the edge of reality. And it offers a highly credible news feed, a section of the site staffed by experts who provide carefully curated UFO material, and a subscription-only section with a thriving community of participants. His podcast, Dreamland, can be seen weekly on YouTube and listened to on his website, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast sites. And his book, Supernatural, which I also have here, if I can get the camera to show it. There we go. It was written with Dr. Jeffrey Kripal. They co-wrote it. Considered among the definitive academic works in the field of unknown and unexplained experiences. And Dr. Kripal, who has been on this program as well, is the Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. Whitley currently lives in California. So, again, Whitley, I'm really excited about this. I've been familiar with your works for a few years now, and I've read Communion. I've read several of your other, Breakthrough, Transformation. I've read them, and then I really liked the Supernatural book that you did with Dr. Kripal, and I would like to discuss some of that today. But first, I wanted to say to you, I have met at this point, I've spoken with a lot of experiencers, and, it takes a certain degree of courage to be willing to go public with these stories. And I wanted to just, personally thank you for being one of the first who was willing to really share this with a widespread audience, because the influence of you doing that was really, really profound, and I think it gave, I've looked at the collection of your letters at Rice University that are there in the archives of people who wrote to you, after they read your book Communion, and, what you did really inspired others to open up about these experiences. And I know that, it didn't come without cost to you. I know that, you've dealt with a lot in response to sharing your story. So I just wanted to personally say thank you for having the courage to share that with us and giving others a space to share their stories as well. And I hope that resonates with you a little bit.
No, well, thank you very much. It definitely does. And I appreciate your kind words. And I still often wondered, how in the world did I get involved in this? Because I had no idea at the beginning. We thought it was like a few hundred people.
Right.
And, the publisher and hoped, and I hoped, the book would be popular the I had no idea that it would initiate contact basically with for millions of people who had had these experiences. No one knew that they were even there, that had happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep going.
Had I known that before I wrote the book and published it, I might not have been able to get to it. I've been too scary. But
Wow.
then I, of course, ended up in this tornadic maelstrom of derision and ended up being probably the only person in modern history whose rape became an international joke of all things to have happened to you. It was hard.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah, to not only go through that, but then the way that, people mocked you in public discourse and in media. I remember watching that first South Park episode as a kid. I had no idea at the time that it was about you. I was too young. But yeah, absolutely, to go public with it and then to receive some of the response that you did.
Yeah, that's hard.
It was, yeah. And so
there's a documentary on, I believe, on MGM Plus right now, produced by Lynn Lear, Norman Lear's wife, that the second episode of which gets into what happened to me rather deeply and includes clips from that South Park episode.
Wow.
So it's quite powerful. So if anyone is interested, do get onto the MGM Plus app and watch it. It's worth watching, I think.
Okay. I'm definitely interested. So thank you for that. So I'm excited to dive more into some of the questions. I first want to introduce the subject of phenomenology a little bit more, both for our viewers who might be joining us for the first time, and then always a little refresher for the speaker as well. So phenomenology is a philosophical method that's rooted in the first person rigorous examination of consciousness. Edmund Husserl was the founder of phenomenology, and he advocated a method of bracketing in which we suspend judgment on the source or origin of what is being interacted with and describe what appears. So phenomenological analysis involves describing exactly what appears to the individual, as well as how what appears is received, organized, and classified by the individual who's experiencing it. So with phenomenology, we have to be very careful describing exactly how the object is presented and experienced by consciousness. Is it perceptual, remembered, imagined, etc.? While the scientific method is focused on collecting physical evidence that can be objectively verified in controlled conditions, the phenomenological method rigorously examines the experience of the witness, what they saw, what they heard, what they sensed, what they felt, and formed judgments about, and how they integrated this into their experience of self, other, and world. So with that in mind, as I said, I've read the progression of your thought over many of your books and kind of your own approach to taking these, your own approach to thinking about your own experiences. And I see you employing phenomenology a lot in the sense that you often suspend judgment on exactly what you're interacting with. So why do you think it's really important when we're examining either your experiences or anyone else's that we don't, jump to a conclusion, immediate conclusion about what it is that we're experiencing?
If we don't do it that way, if we draw conclusions, we're drawing them out of the thin air, and that is not going to be effective. It happens all the time. And what is happening because of it are two things. One, in the intellectual communities, in the academic and scientific communities, the lack of an empirical foundation is causing the whole experience to be rejected as basically as unverifiable.
Right.
And you don't go anywhere beyond it. It's unverifiable. We have nothing further to do. Among the experiencers themselves, this same process is leading to the generation of a folklore.
Okay.
Because we do not have the conclusions that are being drawn. We do not know if there are different alien species. We do not know if there are even alien species involved. We do not know what planets they're coming from or anything like that. But I could look on the internet and find websites which will identify all of the different species and all of the different planets they're from and all of the different interactions they have with each other. And it's all in here, not out there. So I think that a rigorous approach, a phenomenological approach, is absolutely essential to bringing this into focus. We cannot bring it into focus empirically yet, but we can with a good phenomenological approach.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. You know, when you say it's all in here, it's not out there. I just want to, you know, follow up on that a little bit because, you know, I think what you're saying is not that they're not having real experiences. They are, but kind of the stories that they're telling about these experiences, you know, and as you said, the different categories of beings and saying, oh, they're from this planet and there's this many species. Or, you know, quite often I see things that are assuming, you know, what their agenda is, you know, or, you know, this group of aliens and these are good, and, you know, this group and they have these ulterior motives and things like that, that those extrapolations on the experience are more coming from the individual's mind.
That's correct. That's what I was trying to say. Yeah, I didn't want to imply, or I don't want to imply that the experience itself isn't valid. It is very valid, but the discipline comes in not going beyond what we have, and that's where a phenomenologist is so important, and why I'm here actually, because I think that your discipline is the key to bringing this into greater focus.
Again, thank you. I agree with you, right? I think this rigorous analysis of what people are experiencing and a very careful consideration of the different aspects of the experience has to be our starting point. I wanted to follow up, you know, you in your books, you know, you call the beings that you interact with, you call them the visitors, right? You don't call them the aliens, you don't call them the extraterrestrials. And I've seen you, I think, be very, or just bring up things that I think others who are interested in this subject either miss or they just kind of conveniently ignore when it comes to these experiences. So what have you seen or what do you think are the shortcomings of the very straightforward extraterrestrial hypothesis? You know, some people say, you know, these UAP or these UFOs, they're piloted by ETs from another planet, and you have really suspended judgment on that. You've said you're not ruling it out, but you're also don't jump to that conclusion. So what do you think are the shortcomings of the ET hypothesis?
Well, it's very straightforward. We haven't been there. Therefore, we don't know where there is or what there is that I can point to. For example, I can show in the letters and in my own experience and the experiences people had at our cabin some kind of a connection between what I call the visitors and what we think of as the dead and the afterlife, which may not even be there. They may be in here. And so that leads you to the question of the visitors themselves and where they are. And we don't actually know, we don't have an answer to that question. So I think we have to be much more rigorous than we have been. We have a tendency to connect dots in order to make the world make sense to us. Mm-hmm. And this comes out of it comes out of the way the brain functions. So we're going to do that whether we know it or not. We're always going to build sense into perceptions. And it's when we take a rigorous look at that, knowing that this is being done by the brain, We know it. But we take a rigorous look at it and we say to ourselves, okay, this looks to me like an alien from another planet. And it acts like something like that. But there I have to stop. That's what it appears to be to me. I do not have any idea where this actually comes from. And once you open the door that way, incidentally, you also open the door to things like the neurological sciences, because it becomes clear that the way the brain is processing these memories could be a useful tool if we could understand just how that's working. And there is, but we're not there yet. I don't think that a neuroscientist is going to be able to say with certainty that a specific memory is being generated from a physical experience and another one is imaginary. Not yet, but that is going to be possible because we are learning how the brain assembles memories, and it assembles imaginary memories differently from the way it assembles memories of physical experience, apparently, but it's very complex, and we haven't got a roadmap yet, but we know that it seems to be different. So that's a possibility. But before we go there, it's so important to not connect those dots.
Absolutely. I think that this is really important. And what you just said is really interesting, right? The possibility that, neuroscience might be able to, at some point, we're not there yet, but they may at some point be able to differentiate. Is that a memory of an actual physical encounter that you had? Or was that a memory of something that was either in the imagination or that was, non-physical in some way?
Yeah.
You've had a lot of experiences, thinking through some of the descriptions of the events in your book. Most of your experiences were quite physical, and even you would describe sometimes. I remember there was you were doing meditation sessions, and there was some kind of like short man, I think that was that you were appearing for a while, but you never saw him as an apparition. You thought he had some kind of embodiment. Do you feel like most of the let's just use the word entities or visitors, that you've interacted with, are physically embodied in some way?
That's a really interesting question, and I can only tell you what I have observed.
Okay.
I have a vague memory, and I do not know how original this is in terms of its physicality, of seeing these little gray beings kind of coming to life as if they were being inhabited by something I couldn't see, the bodies. I have had many experiences right here in this flat all the time. In fact, yesterday, at 3:00 this morning, it's constant of being touched, of being some vibratory energy touching my body, being, as happened night before last, being kissed by a non-existent being, a non-physical presence.
Wow.
And this is an ordinary part of my life. But what is it? Is it me, or is it real, or is it memorized? I just can't tell. And I don't intend to advocate anything about it, except that it is I do perceive these things. So this is a profound gray area. And the other problem with the neurological approach is these experiences are going to be all mixed up between physical aspects and non-physical aspects and imagination and ultra high strangeness. So it's going to be like a Gordian knot that we can't cut. We're going to have to pick it apart if we want to figure out exactly what's going on.
This is where I was going to go next. I think that something that we need to come to terms with about this phenomenon is that it does present in both physical and quasi-physical, and as you point out, non-physical ways. And
Yes.
some of aspects of the experience do seem very straightforward and to be taking place, at least in the parameters of physical reality as we understand it. And some aspects, as you say, these high strangeness elements don't seem to necessarily be taking place, having in the same mode of perception through which I'm perceiving like the desk in front of me or something like that. There's some kind of expanded awareness happening in these experiences. You say you ended or you began communion with this quote, the human mind like winks back from the dark. And then
Right.
you said in Supernatural, with the book you wrote with Jeff, you said, when I wrote that, I didn't mean that the experience was in the mind. I meant that the mind might not be entirely in us. And I was just
Yes.
wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more, what you mean by that and why you think that idea might help us understand some of what's going on.
Are we generating consciousness or participating in consciousness? This is the question. And it's a question we actually may be able to answer empirically at some point. I know that there's a lot of interest in this question at the neurological level, and quite a few neurologists who would argue that this is absolutely ridiculous, that it is all consciousness is in here. But there's also another strain in that community, and it's beginning to have more credibility, that possibly consciousness is a field in which we participate. I don't yet know the answer to the question, but in terms of my own perceptions, yes, it is a field in which we participate. It isn't completely inside the head. And not only that, there are conditions of consciousness in the non-physical level, at least in the way we perceive it, that do have separate identities that are coherent and persistent. In other words, it's not just a field of awareness. It contains entities, and the entities have personalities and reality. And I often wonder if they perceive themselves as being non-physical and exactly how they think of us. I had, after my wife died, extensive conversations with her after she was very much of an empiricist. And before, years ago, when we were she was reading all the letters that were coming in, she came out of her office one day and said, "Whitley, this has something to do with what we call death." And this was because so many of the letters, it's a kind of mixture of apparent alien contact and the presence of the dead friends and relatives or family members, even from the distant past. It's quite remarkable in that respect. And we had that experience at our cabin. Not so much me, but other people would come to the cabin and have experiences, and they weren't like isolated. They were group experiences. They were very complex, and there's no question about the fact, in my mind, I mean, I can't put it in your mind, but in my mind, I can assure you that it did seem to be external experience for these people. And that's certainly how they perceived it. But it was a mixture. You would see, for example, when someone would suddenly see a dead friend or relative, usually in the evening, Annie would say to me quietly, "The visitors will be here later." And the little people would show up later, smelling like they came up through the floor of the forest, not down from above, because we were in the woods, and the forest floor, as you probably know, I don't know if you're ever in, you try digging down in the forest floor a little bit, and you'll find it's very pungent because it's full of rotting leaves, of course. And that's how they smelled, like they'd come up through that. And so what were we dealing with? I don't see, they didn't seem to be coming out of a flying saucer. They seemed to be coming up from below. And yet at the same time, we had numerous experiences there of obvious flying objects and flying saucers, including some that had been, it looked like devised to tickle your humor. I mean, it was amazing in this respect. Now,
can you describe any that what you said had been devised to seem to tickle your humor?
Yeah, absolutely. After the experience and before I before the book was published, actually, I was really wishing that Anne could see something, because was a very perceptive human being, and she knew it was real, but because of, among other things, the medical issues I had, but she didn't get to see anything. They didn't come to her, and we were working together so closely on it. I wanted her to see something. One night we were in our hot tub one winter night, and suddenly we heard this noise above the house, which sounded a little bit like, well, it's hard to describe. It was like a whirring propeller, or not quite that. It was a little bit more odder than that. But in any case, there moved over the hot tub at an altitude of not 25 feet. I mean, right there.
Wow. Okay, very close.
What you could see clearly looked like a flying pile of wood covered with Christmas lights.
I think I remember this from one of your books.
And it flew off and went off along above the woods, and then disappeared up a draw behind the house. And she said to me, "Whitley, you can't go up in things like that." I said, "I'm not going up in things like that. I have no idea what that was." I would have thought it was a practical joke by one of the neighbors, except how would they do it?
With it, right.
Right. I mean, it's impossible anyway. Nobody at that time knew what had happened. We were keeping it very much to ourselves. And so that was her UFO.
Wow.
And I learned from that there is a heavy-handed but definite sense of humor involved here.
That's interesting.
Yes. And I've had that in my life very recently, in fact.
Would you like to share?
Sure. You're a phenomenologist. You're going to really enjoy this one.
Yes. I'm really enjoying this already. Go ahead.
Okay. After Annie passed away, I was waked up every night for years in various ways, having my nipple pinched, having my toe electrified, being someone blowing in my face, a little dry kiss, which is what I mentioned earlier, has happened the other night. It used to happen a lot. All kinds of different things. A school bell going off in the living room, an old-fashioned school bell like you used to hear in the hall in the old days, and may still. I haven't been to school in a long time. Mm-hmm. All kinds of ways of waking me up. Eventually, I discovered that this insistence on me waking up and sitting and doing an exercise called the sensing exercise that basically takes your attention out of your mind and opens your mind was very well known in yoga. It's called Brahma Muhurta time, the time of the mind being most open. And I would indeed get really wonderful material. I began to use this time to write my books, and that's what I do now. I do it every morning. Okay, so that was there. About a year ago, they stopped waking me up regularly. And you can't do it with an alarm clock because it's supposed to be an hour and a half before dawn. And it varied enough to where I know that that's exactly what they were doing. So there was no way to set an alarm, and I was having trouble because, you need sleep and you have to be very careful. This is this could be a very unhealthy thing to be doing. You have to really know you have to really understand your body in order to do this and thrive. So I said in my head, I'm having trouble waking myself up. Would you help me again? This was not wanted. They felt, I suppose, that I was ready. And here is what happened as a response. I'm in bed, and suddenly I am awakened by scurrying on the floor, loud noises of something big moving around on the floor of the bedroom. And I have no pets. So naturally, I was concerned. It didn't sound like one of the grays who kind of make a tapping noise or a human being. It sounded like something big and an animal. And that's exactly what it turned out to be. I opened my eyes and looked out of the bed, and there was a spider with an abdomen about the size of a basketball.
Oh my God.
And perched on top of it was all of the intricate eyes and the mouth parts, but big. It was huge, and it had huge legs. It filled half the room.
Wow.
But here's the other thing about it that was so extraordinary. Out of the back of it, behind its head, there was a tube coming up into the air, and on the front of the tube, a round thing that looked like a small shower head, which was turning around and suddenly focused on me. And I thought, my God, what can this be? Naturally, I was wide awake by that point, as you may imagine. And it proceeds to spray liquid in my face. I leaped out of the bed. It disappeared, of course. I never thought for a moment it was really there. I've been doing this too long.
Okay.
But then I realized, well, it might not have been there, Whitley, but your face seems to be wet. So I rushed into the bathroom, and my face was wet.
It was wet.
Oh, yeah, it was wet. And I thought, oh, dear. I immediately washed my face. And then I went to do the exercise, and I thought, okay, maybe it's not a good idea to ask them to wake me up anymore.
This is what they're going to do.
This was the response. And so I still get waked up every once in a while, but I'm expected to do it myself. Clearly. And you see how a phenomenologist can help here, but not necessarily a scientist, although
right.
Should I have taken samples of that material on my face? It was just like water, and it had no effects whatsoever. And my guess is if I had it analyzed, it would have been water.
Sure. I mean, but what you're describing here is something that I think is really important and really common in these experiences, in that, you know, you see something and your eyes are open, and it's something very strange. It's this bizarre looking spider, and it sprays water at you, and then it just disappears, disintegrates. And so you said, okay, I've been doing this long enough. I didn't think it was actually there. And that's quite often how these experiences go. And, there's this idea of, it was just a trick of my mind. It was, a hallucination, or I had just woken up. I was, still in a sleepy state or something like that. But then often there's something left behind, something subtle, like for you, your face was actually wet,
right.
Or sometimes people have a really powerful dream and then they would write it off as just a dream, but then there's some kind of a mark, left on their body or something like that. There's some kind of like small, subtle clue left behind that this wasn't just purely a hallucination in the way that we think of hallucination. That, you said, it wasn't really there in the way that physical things that we interact with are there. But I also don't see it as, purely illusionary either. It seems like it was there in some way, in its own kind of intermediary way.
Well, who knows? Maybe there's a parallel universe in which spiders like that actually do exist. but I just hope we don't go there, or they don't they don't end up coming out.
Sure. Or maybe maybe the way you were seeing it is not, it
Right.
was not
Maybe
matching what was actually present.
Maybe what was there and what I was seeing are two entirely different things.
Right, two entirely different things.
Because these beings, there are physical people. I've described, I think, in the book with Jeff and other books, I believe in Solving the Communion Enigma, and also probably I referred to it in A New World, a long period of time in which a boy lived behind our cabin, and I now understand he was telepathic, very telepathic. And this is quite an ordinary part of the experience. I'm sure other experiences have mentioned it to you. And he was also autistic, extremely autistic. And there's studies I'm aware of going on now, sort of at the fringes of psychology, of autism and telepathy, because telepathy is going to emerge in our life experience as a real phenomenon fairly soon, I think, because so many people are having close encounter experiences, and I've had moments of complete telepathy where I could hear everything around me, everyone around me, and I found them extremely embarrassing. But they're not like schizophrenic. I went to the literature to study schizophrenic voice production, and it wasn't that at all, because they were not in any way referential toward me. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there right now. My point, no, darn it, I've slipped off the line I was talking on. Where was I? Do you recall?
I'm trying to remember. You were talking about a boy who was outside of your cabin.
The boy. Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry.
No worries.
His telepathic abilities so arrested my attention that when I get to that, I begin to remember what that was like, and it was appalling, because he could come right into your mind and you knew it. It was nothing esoteric about it. He was there, and he was a boy, and he wanted to go into my private mind, into my sexuality, and places like that it would interest a young boy at the edge of puberty. So it was horrifying.
And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
He smoked all the time. I mean, we would find in the woods these places where he had stood, because he would be right at the edge of the woods where we couldn't see him, but we would know he was there because we could hear him moving around and so forth. And if you would find these places where there were hundreds of cigarette butts, he smoked all the time. I never saw anything like it. But what made it more appalling was we lost the cabin. Thank you, South Park. They were instrumental in causing my sales to drop, to collapse, of not just my UFO books, but of everything. People will buy a book from someone controversial, but not from someone who's being laughed at, because they don't want to be laughed at. So anyway, we drove down to San Antonio, to a little flat we still owned. The list beyond that flat was homelessness, so we were pretty desperate.
I see.
He followed us and began standing in a little cul-de-sac immediately outside of the flat, smoking constantly at night. During the day, you couldn't find him. Then, at one point, he climbed a wall in the building and pulled the spokes out of the bicycle tires of some people who were living in another flat, causing them to call Texas Social Services on the theory that there was some kind of feral child in the complex. I installed a motion-sensitive light in the little cul-de-sac, and one morning he came blasting around a corner between two of the buildings, smoking away, and strode off down the middle of the street. And I never saw him again. not until years later. But I'm talking to you not about something that is in any way in the head. This boy was real. And I now know he's not alone. There's quite a few people like that around. I've met others.
And you didn't interpret him as being, like, for lack of a better word, like paranormal. He was a person that.
Well, I mean, he was definitely a physical person. Okay. And I don't like to talk about who these people are, but they're real. They're quite
the abilities that he showed, the telepathic abilities that he showed were very
overwhelming. When you're near them, you know, people always say, well, I'm a hybrid. And I think to myself, I'm polite, of course. And I think to myself, I'm not hearing you in my head. So I don't think that's what you are, because I've been with these people quite a few times, actually. And I'm not going to get into it in detail because they don't want that. They've made that very clear to me. Okay. But they are there and they are physical and they're somehow connected to this. But this is where you have to end it. This is where the phenomenon part of it becomes muddy. Why are they connected with it? Is it because they have telepathy that I assume they're connected with it? Or is that just something that's developing in the human species right now? I don't know.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting that this conversation of, like, you know, telepathy emerges. Obviously, I know that telepathy is very common in close encounter experiences.
Yes.
I was very recently introduced to a podcast called the Telepathy Tapes. And they, you know, if you haven't listened to it yet, check it out. It's about telepathic abilities, specifically in non-speaking people with autism, and how they are able to demonstrate under controlled settings telepathic abilities that are just undeniable. And this is actually even scientifically verified at this point. Quite often they were thought to not be able to communicate at all, and they actually found, at least with their caregivers, that they're demonstrating extremely strong telepathic abilities. You know, and I think that your approach, what you just described here, is really important. You said, you know, he's a physical person. He was displaying telepathy that was undeniable. But that's kind of as far as we can go with it. You know, we cannot speculate, you know, who exactly is he? Is he a hybrid? Is he this or that or the other? Because, you know, or is he, you know, sometimes they say, oh, they're an extraterrestrial disguised as a human or something like that. And I think that you're correct that we cannot make those kind of judgments. It's, you know, you're interacting with a physical person or somebody who is physically embodied. You know, we don't know more than that, but and he was displaying, you know, very strong telepathic abilities with you, and that's, you know, as far as you can go in terms of describing.
There's one additional thing. He was also displaying symptoms of autism, of extraordinary autism, because I did try to approach him a number of times, and he could not handle. He was obviously autistic. It was very clear. It was very profoundly autistic,
or some form of neurodivergence.
Right. Yeah, he certainly appeared to be. And I'm not a doctor. I do know a significant amount about these unusual states by this time. I've studied them fairly carefully. I do know about that podcast, by the way, and I'm planning to interview those people as soon as I can on my show.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was very well done, and it's very interesting. So, Whitley, I want to bring the conversation back to something you said earlier about the appearances of the dead, in particular, and you know, this is something that you and of course Anne have brought up that I think is extremely important, at least as a clue. Can you take us back to, you know, the experience that started it all, in terms of there was a deceased person who was there that night who you know, left out of the original book, communion book, the original description. Can you just start there, and then I want to follow up a little bit more about it. Can you tell us about the person who was there and how you discovered that he was deceased?
Yes. He was we sat for a brief time in the woods in a circle. Most of the people in the circle, there were probably 6 or 7 of them, were wearing bodysuits and helmets that had round eye holes and a round mouth hole, and they were quite small. I assume that under those helmets there was something other than a normal human being, simply because of their size. But if the helmets had been taken off and it had turned out to be midgets or children, I wouldn't have been surprised. In fact, at the time, the idea of aliens and so forth wasn't in my mind, so I would have assumed that. There was, however, one person there, much larger, and I recognized him from school, from high school and college. We'd gone to high school and college together. I'd known him quite well. He was a good friend, and he had joined the Central Intelligence Agency after college and kind of disappeared into it, which does happen, obviously. And I hadn't seen him in years. He proceeded to give me all kinds of detailed information about flaws in the exhaust manifolds of stealth aircraft, which were then a deep, dark secret. You didn't know about them in public except just rumors. And it was such detail, I was amazed. Later, one did crash and had a fire, and I assume it was because these descriptions were correct. In any case, after the experience, I was so traumatized that it was very confused at first. Eventually, over time, the memories became more clear. This is before I was hypnotized by Dr. Klein or anything. And I remembered him. And I thought to myself, what if this was some kind of a dirty trick?
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking in terms of a crime, because I knew I had been injured. And I was thinking of it in terms of some kind of crime, that somebody had maybe infused me with some hallucinogen or something. I was really all over the lot about it, worrying about it. Was it a brain tumor? So I decided I would call him on the theory that maybe this was a real event. And I did call him, and his number was disconnected. So I called his brother, and his brother said, well, Whitley, he's been dead since he died last March. This was in December.
Wow. And
that was my first clue that the dead were somehow involved here. Whether or not that means, and this is where you have to be careful, and a rigorous phenomenological look at this is so important. Does that mean that the dead still exist and they're with the aliens or the visitors? Or does it mean something else about our minds, or about whatever this presence is and what it wishes to project into our minds? We don't actually know the answers to those questions. I react to it and believe that the dead do still exist, but that doesn't mean that I necessarily would assert that as a fact.
Yeah, I think that's the right approach, to have. And I think what's so interesting about that particular experience that you describe is that, in these experiences, the deceased show up. I see that in your letters, in the letters that people wrote to you. And sometimes people will want to dismiss it as, wishful thinking, or that their brain saw something they hadn't seen before, and so interprets it as their dead grandmother or something like that.
Yes.
But what's so interesting about your experience is that you did not know that individual was deceased that night.
I didn't.
And so there would be no reason for, you to be, wishing, have that be fulfilling some kind of wish or desire you had to see him again, because you didn't know.
And I didn't have any wish or desire to see him again either.
It wasn't even someone you were missing.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't missing him at all. I hadn't talked to him in years. We'd been college friends, and those friendships, they go away. And I still I had no reason to dislike him. I mean,
Sure.
if I'd seen him on the street, I would have been glad to say hello and catch up.
Right.
But you know, he wasn't in my social circle anymore.
Right. He wasn't someone you were currently thinking about.
Not at all. No.
Right. And that to me stands out, you know, at least as a clue in terms of, you know, we can't jump to any conclusions, like you said, and we can't assume that this means that actually was him as a deceased person. You know, it could be something else, as you said, in terms of how this intelligence is interacting with us and what they want us to see. You know, maybe one aspect of their communication is you know, projecting the dead towards us. But I think that even if they are doing that, it suggests that something much deeper is going on than just, as you've said, the idea that these are visitors who just came from another planet and happened to find us here. You know, they would have to know intimate details about our lives in order to project, you know, images, or, you know, cause us to see, you know, deceased persons as part of the experience. You know, so to me, it no matter, I agree, we can't draw a definitive conclusion, but it suggests that they're connected to us in a way that's much deeper than just being a species that had a totally different evolutionary trajectory on another planet. Like they seem to know us in you know, almost very personal, intimate ways.
It's certainly they do. You know, if you get involved with them, the more you get involved with them, the more clear that becomes. And you know, after a while, you come to realize they know you better than you do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a, if they are aliens from another planet, I would really love to see what it's like on that planet and what their societies are like, because they are fluently telepathic. When you're with the Greys, you're telepathic too, and they can't talk anyway. They don't have that. They don't have that that type of vocal ability. Their vocalization and breathing system works more like birds, and so they, you know, they couldn't talk if they wanted to.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is another thing. Whenever people say, "Well, he said his name was Gubu," and I think to myself, maybe he didn't say his name was anything.
Maybe that's what it came out.
Because why would they have names if they can't vocalize? You know, and the ones I have known physically absolutely cannot vocalize.
It's interesting.
They can make vocalizations that are incredibly powerful and enormously subtle emotionally, but they're not words. You know, birds can make all kinds of sounds, and some of them can make very extraordinary sounds, but they can't, that type of anatomy is never going to be able to form a word. They can't. At
least not the types of words that
no, but you can hear them in your head. The visitors can form words very easily in your head.
In your head, right? The telepathic communication. You know, why do you think the mainstream UFO conversation, you pointed this out, you know, like 30 years ago now, that the dead appear alongside the visitors. But I feel like that idea has still not made it into the mainstream understanding about UFOs and UAP. Why do you think that that's the case? You know, what
we are still trying to fit this into our understood reality.
Right.
And it doesn't belong there. It's not going to fit. We haven't faced that yet. We haven't faced the fact that our understood reality has exploded and collapsed in flames. And we're just working on getting that together in our collective intellect. But it's happened to us many times before in human history, and we're actually quite good at dealing with it. We've always dealt with it in the past very efficiently and have come out of it way ahead. Right, and a perfect example is the appearance of Delirium Natura on the Lucretius poem on the nature of things, when it was rediscovered in the Renaissance, in the early Renaissance, it blew up the intellectual community completely and the scientific community that existed then. And, you know, yes, a few people got burned up because of it, and Galileo ended up under house arrest, but here we are. It led ultimately to a sort of critical mass, and we had the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment. We're in the same position right now. We are just, this De Rerum Natura we've just been peeking into it, and we think, oh my God, what's in this? This isn't what we're supposed to believe. This isn't our reality. We close the book and we say, let's go back to empiricism. Right now, we're going back. We can't do this. But then, you know, that same man, the scientist, sees something strange in the sky, and he goes back to the book and he peeks in again. That's where we are. We'll open the book and start turning the pages soon enough, and we will succeed as long as the environment holds out. If it collapses, then it's going to get sticky. But, you know, that's the human world, and this planet Earth. It's an unstable planet, and it's, you know, we had the Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago, and nearly extinguished us.
Right.
And the planet is very unstable. So that, incidentally, is also why we're here. The human intellect is a response to a continuous need to rethink adaptation. And we are in that state now with this experience. This presence is forcing us to do that again. And as I said at the beginning of this part of the conversation, we're good at it, and we will succeed.
I like your optimism. You know, I hear a lot of, you know, within the UFO community or the UAP discussion, you know, disclosure comes up a lot, and this idea that, you know, the government needs to disclose what they know. And I obviously agree with that. You know, if there are things that have been hidden, you know, I do think they need to be disclosed. But I also think that, you know, truly understanding what is going on here. Yes, we need the full scope of the information that's out there. But I don't think that they, as you said, you know, we want this to fit neatly within our understanding of reality, and it doesn't. So how do you even begin to disclose something that defies the parameters of all of our mainstream understandings about what is real or isn't real? I feel like it's a very difficult thing to disclose. You know, I feel like more that the understanding of this is probably going to come from the experiences themselves, from people actually, you know, who are going through these contact experiences and realizing that, hey, as you said, you know, the spectrum of reality is actually much bigger than we thought. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the only things that I know of that the federal government, that the Defense Department has, that would help this narrative if they were disclosed, as information about the materials, which have been studied extensively, not just at Battelle Memorial Institute, but also throughout the whole defense establishment, and what that resulted in, and what those materials are, and the bodies. We've got bodies. They were, the last time I was involved in any way whatsoever, and I've never seen them personally, and I don't have any classified information I shouldn't possess. They were at Fort Detrick in Maryland, and they may still be there. They're just there, and they're not human bodies. And that would be enough. And I would think that it would be, anything more would be too much, because the problem is that you're going to get basically the military's ideas about what this is.
Right.
That's not useful, because
Yeah, I agree.
their ideas are not necessarily right or wrong, but they're military, and that's not where we need to go. This is not a threat on that level. If it was a threat on a military level, they would have done what they were going to do a long time ago. It is threatening, though, on a lot of very different levels that I don't think the average military officer can think about or articulate. And this level of threat is where the intellectual community, much more than the scientific community, the academic community, the philosophers, this is where they come in. You come in, because you are where we will learn how to focus this in such a way that it feeds human knowledge rather than creates confusion that we can't extract ourselves from. So the military they've shot at them and they've been hurt because of that, and they have injured some of them. It hasn't been pretty. And okay, that's the military. Harry Truman gave this to the military. He'd just come off of World War II. The generals involved in this had all been fighting for years, and they kept fighting because they saw when they realized that the initial objects that had fallen and the bodies in them were not human. And as General Exon said to me years ago, he said everyone from Truman on down knew that what we had found was not of this world within 24 hours of our finding it. What did those guys conclude? An invasion. They didn't react to it the way you would have had you been there. And their reaction was incorrect. And now the phenomenon addresses them as if their reaction was correct, because it can't do anything else. It can't when they're shooting at it, it's going to defend itself, making it look like a conflict.
And it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that this is important because the threat narrative is very strong right now, as you mentioned, like in the idea of disclosure, and is this a threat to the United States? And I think your language was correct. Like it's not right or wrong, but it's just seeing it through a very narrow lens. Yeah. And the idea that you said it could be dangerous in other ways, but that's where the humanities folks and the philosophers become very important, because yes, the way I see it is that it also it also can be extremely exciting and
exactly
kind of opens up possibilities for us, existential possibilities for who we can be as a species. And I think the attitude that we take towards it, are we coming to it with an attitude of fear, or are we coming to it with an attitude of curiosity, caution, but curiosity, and asking what possibilities this enables for our understanding of who we are and who we are in relation to who they might be. I think that could be very transformative for humanity and just for our entire understanding of self and world.
Well, I think that there's a very exact parallel here between what happened when On the Nature of Things appeared in the European intellectual community and what's happening now. The established scientific, that is to say theological, they were very intertwined at the time, powers viewed this as a demonic invasion. In other words, the ideas that began to flow into the culture out of the minds of people like Galileo and Copernicus were viewed as demonic interventions designed to confuse us about who we are and what we are. And this is essentially the same. If you get involved with people in aerospace security in the Air Force, you will soon find a general belief, not completely general, but a significant number of people in this community, and they are centered around the Air Materiel Command to this day, who believe this exactly is what's happening now. It is a demonic intervention.
Right.
And they, of course, you can imagine how they demonize me. And, on the surface, they ignore me because you're supposed to ignore demons. And that ignoring of my output extends deeply into the culture. Like, you will never see a review of any of my books in like the New York Times or anything. I'm an outlier in the culture, but I am nevertheless an efficient interpreter of the culture's needs and its abilities. And I could be useful at a much more open level of the culture, but that's not going to happen. And the whole close encounter community, I think, is seriously in jeopardy because these people are powerful. And it's this disclosure we were talking about earlier proceeds, if it does, it concretizes the experience, and it means that the people who claim to have been abducted are going to be believed.
Right.
And at some level inside that community of the defense community, there's going to be a response to that, and it is going to be two-layered. One is they will have captive close encounter witnesses who agree this is demonic, and they will become part of the public conversation. The rest of them are going to be rejected in various ways, and I'm sure that there are social engineers within the Defense Department already working on that. And of course, number one rejectee is right here.
Well, I think also, because this was mentioned in Lou Elizondo's book too, that there's people within, the formal channels who are saying, don't engage with this because it's demonic.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's so problematic. And I think that it points back exactly at why we need phenomenology, because again, they're not assuming the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but they're assuming, this idea of demons, which has this whole, all of this religious connotation that's attached to it.
Yes.
And putting, that label on it and saying, stay away from it. It's a demon. And that has been very harmful to the conversation. And as you point out, that you can find contactees or abductees who will affirm that, because they feel like they had a negative experience, and they may be framing the experience within a religious lens. And so to them, it makes sense that it's demonic. But that doesn't represent, or that doesn't necessarily get us any closer to understanding, what's truly going on here. I think it really just, it's a huge distraction, right? And it's not intellectually rigorous or honest, taking that approach. And this idea of, how important I think that experiencers like yourself and others who have gone through this but remain critically minded about what it might be, and who are careful in terms of making assumptions about what you're interacting with. I think this kind of testimony is so important from the academic side. Leave out what the government decides to do, but in terms of the academy and the university and how we study it, I think that experiencer testimony, have a critical examination of experiencer testimony, not just, as you said at the beginning, whatever mythology or folklore that somebody wants to map on top of it, but a really phenomenological, critically rigorous examination of experiencer testimony has to be like a really key part of the discussion
Yes.
But in many of the academic conferences that have been had on this so far, it's been mostly scholars speaking, and it's been, with the exception, I think you spoke at Rice a couple years ago. But, mainly there have not been many experiencers featured. And first of all, why do you think that's the case? Why, I obviously have my own suspicions, but, why do you think the academic community has been hesitant to include experiencers? And why is it so important that we be listening to experiencers?
Well, I'm very involved with the Soul Foundation at Stanford. As an experiencer, I'm not going to be speaking there.
Okay.
Because it simply isn't time. There has to be, well, let's see. Let me see if I can find, there's quite a discussion going on let me see if I can find what I said earlier this morning, because I tried to sum it up as clearly as I could. And let me see, gosh, the conference is so active. Okay, yeah, here it is. A convergence of the scientific and religious communities in regard to close encounter would be very interesting. The religious community is already involved in numerous different ways, some constructive and some not. Fortunately, we have the engagement, and I mentioned here an Anglican priest, Dan Stork Banks, who is very, very brilliant and engaging in this thing at a high level, who brings very sophisticated and intellectually nuanced religious approach to the table here. I hope that Dan has time to engage with us more, et cetera, et cetera. And then I make reference to Avi Loeb and the SETI community. And he recently published an article on Medium about his own thing, which is the Galileo project, where he believes he has the fragments of an alien spacecraft that crashed on Earth many years ago.
Okay.
And he is getting a lot of pushback from the scientific and academic communities, as you may imagine, because he was the chief head of Department of Astronomy at Harvard. So he's, his voice is important.
Absolutely.
And as far as the close encounter phenomenon is concerned, he's very gingerly about it, and would really not like it to be in the conversation yet at all. And I can't blame him. He's having enough trouble getting his own ideas into the conversation. Okay, I read his article on Medium recently, and with great interest. I am well aware of the pushback he has received, and I understand why the SETI community has banned discussion of UAPs in its forums, which it has. You can't, if you're involved in SETI forums, you can't bring up UAPs or they'll block you.
Wow.
It is because their rice bowl, which means their money, depends on looking for signs of life beyond our planet, not in our backyard.
Yeah.
What they don't know and would never accept anyway is something I discussed, I believe, in A New World, which is that the visitors, as I understand them, would very much like us to find another planet. It's a long text, just a moment. That is broadcasting the presence of intelligent life. The reason is that this would be an empowering foundation for relationship with them. They may even be helping us in some way, for all I know, but you'll never find out that from them. Their obsession with cultural colonization, and this refers directly to what we've been talking about, is very intense. They do not want to colonize our developing search of the intelligent cosmos. They want us as companions, not supplicants. The result of their very necessary silence is that one of the kinds of attacks that can always be effective against someone who is exposed in the way Avi is, or the experiencers are, is to bring up the fact that the crazy experiencer community is part of the overall conversation. That's the problem. That forces someone like Avi into the position where he must reject that community in order to preserve his own credibility as best he can. And that is true
across the board. Yeah.
All. And that's why scientists and academics who want to address this broader issue are going to have a lot of trouble if they begin to try to bring the close encounter witness testimony into it.
No, I absolutely agree. And I've actually, I've been advised, I won't name any names, but, I've had people suggest, like if you want to be taken seriously, then leave the experiencer narratives out of it. And I personally just won't do that because I think the experiencer narratives are so central to what's going on.
Yeah, it's the only thing that really matters in the end.
Well, and as you point out, the idea of SETI is this idea of looking elsewhere. It's like looking on other planets out in space, but it's ignoring the contact experiences that people are having right now. It's like, I don't think we're in a search for contact. I think stories like yours and others within the experiencer communities have shown that some kind of contact is already happening. We don't know where they're from or who they are. But there's some kind of intelligence that's already here interacting with us. And if we want to know what's going on, start with the people who, have witnessed this, is my take. But I think, that's a pretty good diagnosis of the problem in terms of credibility, right? It's yes. that association with the close encounter community just makes somebody kind of immediately, lose their professional status in a way.
Yes, it's fortunate that someone like Jeff Kripal is around, who's too powerful Absolutely. In his community to lose his status.
Yeah,
and has a very solid, knock on wood, chair. So and I was quite worried when he proposed to me that I give the letters to Rice. And I thought to myself, what if this results in people in the scientific and intelligence communities going in and using the letters to debunk try to invalidate the close encounter narrative.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, finally, I thought, well, Whitley, you're going to leave them in storage and you're going to die eventually. And then who knows what will happen. These letters belong to the world and they are first contact. That's what they represent between the ordinary human being and this presence.
Mm-hmm.
And for better or for worse, you just have to cast them to the waters. And that's what I did. I gave them to Rice. And I hope that study of them won't be debased, is all I can say.
And I first of all want to thank you for doing that, because I spent 3 weeks, looking through those letters. I received funding from my university to do so. And, that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't been there in the Rice archives. And, I'm also on the team there, with Jeff and others at Rice who are looking at the letters in a very serious way, right? And we're studying them and we want to bring them into the cultural conversation in a very meaningful way. And some of the content is so rich. And all I can say to you is, at least right now, the research that we're trying to do with them is not about invalidation at all. It's about, sorting through them in a rigorous and scholarly way in order to identify, patterns, identify, the phenomenological structure of these experiences and how it might lend a clue in terms of what's going on overall. Not just a clue, but a very important one, a very key component of the puzzle. So you putting them at Rice, I want to personally thank you for that, because it's opened up some really important possibilities for research that wouldn't be happening otherwise, to be honest. If they were just sitting in storage, we wouldn't be looking at them this way.
I'm very happy about that, because I think that what you're doing, and I'm quite aware of it, of course,
sure,
is excellent. and it's going to be extremely helpful in validating this material, and that means to dimensionalize it in some way. We can't say that it's, oh, this is proof that alien contact is real. It's
Right.
much more subtle and nuanced than that.
Absolutely.
And you are approaching it correctly.
I agree, right? It's a more complex, and as you said, it's more subtle than that. It's not about establishing, incontrovertible proof of an alien invasion or an alien presence or something like that. It's understanding this experience between human beings and some kind of unknown other, intelligent other that's not us but is involved in us, and that we human beings have been having experiences with, and trying to make sense of that and bring it into cultural conversation in a way that will be fruitful and productive, and help us reconceptualize our place in the world and our relationship to whoever they are, is the overarching goal.
If it's not us, the butterfly and the caterpillar,
Sure.
I
Right.
would think would be very surprised to find out that they were related.
That they were related. That's true too, or are they another form of us? Are they, as you said, are they,
Yeah.
I agree. I think they could be, when I say they're us, we obviously don't mean us in just the traditional sense of, oh, it's just all human technology or something like that, but that they may be another form or aspect of us being
Yes,
reflected back to ourselves.
that's correct. And then time comes in, and so you just don't know. One thing is quite clear: if it is possible to move in time, which I very much doubt personally, even though I've had an experience of doing that in my past, I intellectually, I can't see how it's possible, because I don't see that time is a medium like or a force like gravity. It's something in our minds. In any case, if it is possible, if there is a future that's already there in some way, then the only way to defeat the grandfather paradox, which we have proved, at least in modeling moving photons back in time, would be to create something that absolutely didn't exist at all and wasn't real, and use that as our telescope into the past. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to see anything, because the grandfather paradox will always prevent us from doing so. We have to be tricksters.
Interesting.
And if this phenomenon is anything, it's a trickster. For sure.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, the trickster elements are quite strong. Like you said, the humor and the very much of it isn't what it seems at face value. So
that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll give you another example. How much time do we have? I don't know.
Well, we're nearing the end, but we can do another example if you'd like.
Yeah, one last example. I am often engaged with experiencers who, for one reason or another, are going to be able to have contact with the grays. And it's too late. I'm not going to get into how all that works, because I'm not even sure myself.
Okay.
But in any case, I was in a situation like that recently, in an isolated house where some people who have had experiences were there. And one of them in particular kept saying to me, Whitley, I feel like there's somebody in the house that I can't see, which is a very typical thing. It's very ordinary. This person then went on a FaceTime call with the relative. And the relative knows nothing about where the person was or anything that they've had. They have no idea that they've had any kind of experience like this at all in their life. The relatives are completely clueless about this. Suddenly the relative says, "What? There's a giant cat standing behind you." She sees the FaceTime.
He sees it on the FaceTime?
FaceTime. Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God.
And the lady person turns around and doesn't see anything, of
Can't
course.
see anything.
And then later that night, she gets a contact experience.
Mhm.
They were scoping her out. She said to me, I feel like they're sniffing me out. I said, that's probably what's happening.
Probably what's happening. It's yeah, I mean, you hear that again and again, right? It's like it's a sense of a presence, but they don't see anything, and then then there's often some kind of external validation. Somebody else sees something, right?
Well, that's exactly what happened here.
Yeah.
And you know, from a physical standpoint, these entities are very, very small and fragile.
Hmm.
And I think that trying to be with us when we're not in a cage must be extremely challenging to them. I would be to me if I was that small and fragile and dealing with a gigantic, highly intelligent ape like us.
Highly intelligent, highly dangerous.
Well, yeah.
So Whitley, this has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this. We're nearing the end. Is there any kind of final thoughts that you want to leave our viewers with?
Yeah, I think that this community, the community of philosophers, theologians, psychologists, this community in general is where we need to make a good start. And you're the key. The hard sciences come later.
And can you say just more? Why do we need to start here?
Well, two reasons. The first one is there's nowhere else to start.
Okay, I think that's a good point, right? You said at the beginning the empirical stuff isn't there.
And the second one is that you can explore the content without having to identify its origin.
Agreed. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful note to end on, and it shows the importance of phenomenology, because that's exactly what we do. We explore the content, we explore the appearance, we explore the effects, the interpretation, the modalities, the way that it was perceived and organized by consciousness, without having to have the empirical verification of exactly what it is.
Exactly.
And I think this conversation has done a great job of showing how important that is. So Whitley, once again, thank you for today, and then also thank you for your work, thank you for your books. You've been a really valuable contributor to this conversation over the years. And I only came upon your work within the past 5 years, but your books were really helpful to me in terms of influencing my own thinking or my own approach, and also, again, I can't thank you enough for making your letters available at the Rice University Woodson Archives. That has been a tremendous help in terms of, making progress in engaging with experience or testimony in rigorous and scholarly ways. So just one more time, thank you so much.
Well, thank you also for turning toward this in the way that you have.
You're very welcome. I appreciate it so much. So that concludes another episode of Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. I want to thank our viewers for sticking with us throughout this entire year of episodes. Once again, this series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies. I am the host, Kimberly Engels, and I hope you will join us next year for a new series of talks.